Hey everyone, I am the Synodic Scribe, and today we're going to step outside my usual lore content for a hot minute and discuss something that was actually requested by the supporters in my Discord and Patreon. So, if you enjoy this video, show them some love. If you hate this video, just hate me. Leave them alone. I'm making this video because I've been asked how I choose to write my stories or play out my scripts for my videos. So, I wanted to shed some light on that. And if you fancy yourself an avid writer or reader, you might get a kick out of this as well. Stick around for me, I promise to try and make this fun, or at least entertaining. So, let's start by asking ourselves, what is roleplay? Simply put, anyone who is engaging in the act of performing as a certain person or character is in fact role-playing. This definition is much more broad than most people understand, and when people think roleplay, they usually imagine things like Dungeons and Dragons, historical reenactments, LARPing, or other naughty things. But, as written, anyone pretending to be someone or something they're not are technically engaging in roleplay, as what you're doing is attempting to play the role of that noun. Who would have guessed, right? All your favorite actors and actresses are technically role-playing, because while acting is the art of studying and perfecting one's performance, roleplay is simply the decision to perform in the first place. As such, role-players are everywhere, but talented actors, not so much, since not everyone has the burning desire to study the art of performance. It makes sense though. Practically everyone has imagined what it would be like to be someone other than themselves at least once in their lives. Roleplay is just taking that imagination one step further, and is easier to fall into than you think. So with all that in mind, we come to understand that roleplay is not only a social norm, it's all over the place, and celebrated in many forms of media. So, if you enjoy roleplay, don't be ashamed. Love what you love, just don't force what you love onto others and everything should be fine. With that definition out of the way, let's get into the guts of creative writing, storytelling, and character creation. Now, addressing all the different tropes, styles, and formats a character or setting can be written within would take way too much time. So instead, I'm going to gloss over what I see as the most important aspects to any well-written story for role-play-driven characters, starting with the frame of a story. It's important to understand the type of story you're wanting to tell from the very beginning. Where do you see your character starting? What obstacles will they be forced to overcome? Are these problems physical, emotional, or spiritual? And where will they be when all of these things are said and done? These questions are more important than most people realize because they ultimately inform the entirety of the overarching narrative, or simply put, the kind of story you're telling. You don't need to have every little detail hammered out at the very beginning. That process comes much later. Don't get ahead of yourself. But simply understanding where you see your character headed and how their experiences might ultimately affect or change them is really enough. Understanding the core of your narrative is important to every good story because it gives you, the creator, a roadmap to follow from beginning to end. For example, think of a character like Estinian. He starts out as a brooding, vengeful dragon slayer. The conflict in this case is fighting with and getting possessed by Nidhogg, and the resolution leaves him free of possession, yet humbled by his new understanding of dragons and hatred. While this is an overly simplified way to break down stories, you can apply this three-step process to almost anything. Getting an idea of a story's beginning, middle, and end will inform you what kind of tale was trying to be told, or what kind of story you may want to tell yourself. Like I said, this is oversimplifying a lot of things about writing and storytelling, but we're talking about basic roleplay stuff and short stories here. We're not writing a novel. If you want to write a book, then just write a book. Kinda like I do sometimes. Which brings us to our next point, simplification. For those of you who aren't producing an entire screenplay, if you ever feel like you may be overthinking things, remember Occam's razor. Occam's razor is a philosophical rule that states that entities should not be multiplied unnecessarily. This essentially means you should try to keep things simple rather than let your mind explore every possible avenue of something. The more you overthink things, the more complex and difficult to understand those things become. For example, whenever I make lore videos, I follow Occam's razor by sticking to the in-game lore or written material as close as possible. I explain the things I can clearly reference, and I leave the things that aren't clearly explained alone. If I tried to rip apart and overanalyze every little detail in everything, I would be multiplying something unnecessarily. That and the simple fact that personal headcanon is really bad for trying to make lore-accurate videos. However, just because you can keep a story simple doesn't make it bad. Why else do you think people love to see the same hero versus villain stories over and over again? It's simple because the good guys and bad guys are clearly defined and easily understood. As such, it works, and it'll continue to work for all eternity.
Good and evil, the war eternal.
But I digress. Keeping a story simple will ultimately make what we're about to discuss next much easier. Which is important because everyone who has failed to respect our next topic has absolutely ruined their stories. I speak of the almighty continuity. I cannot stress enough how important this part is for any story being told. I've seen new writers make this mistake, and I've seen professional studio writers make this mistake. So if you take nothing else from what I tell you today, please listen to this part. Your story's continuity is the linchpin holding the entire thing together. Continuity is basically the consistency of a story. The idea that everything from beginning to end makes sense with the information present. Failure to observe and respect a story's continuity will ultimately riddle the narrative with the infamous plot holes. Things like comedies are able to get away with creating plot holes because usually that's part of the joke. But in this case, we're trying to create something believable. If you say a particular apple is red in chapter 1 and nothing has happened to it, then the apple must still be red in chapter 2. If said apple is suddenly blue and there's never a reason for it, you've created a continuity error, a plot hole. Cause and effect. X leads to Y. Actions inform consequence. These things are so easily forgotten about, but are the only things keeping your story consistent, and therefore believable. If a spy is saying they need to be careful and avoid undue attention, but then start skipping through town like Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, that breaks the continuity. Why does this matter? Because people are willing to suspend their disbelief and imagine that these fictional stories are real when reading a book or watching a movie. But if there are things happening in said story that don't even make sense in that fictional universe, then that suspension is broken, and the audience often loses interest. Now, this doesn't mean that the things happening in your story need to be predictable. The opposite, actually. You can have all sorts of twists, turns, and surprises in a story so long as they make sense. This is why whenever I write one of my stories for the start of lore content like the job videos, I make sure to thoroughly research the subject matter and try my best to follow the rules of the game's world. A lot of the stories I tell are my own writing, but I try to write them in a way that makes those events believable, even though they're entirely fake. That's because I'm following the continuity of the world I'm writing for. There are tons of stories I've watched, played through, or read where the author or director failed to understand their own story, and as such, the continuity fell apart as a result. You yourself have likely witnessed or got annoyed by plot holes whether you realized it or not. But needless to say, Some of the most popular stories in history usually have a mostly, if not completely, intact continuity. A story's consistency ultimately makes for a more immersive tale. Now that we've covered the structure of a story and how important consistency is, let's go over exposition. Simply put, exposition is an easily understood explanation or description of something. This is important because it's made to flesh out the meaning or purpose of what you're trying to talk about. The reason exposition gets a bad reputation is because you've got a lot of people that don't know when to stop explaining something, or the opposite. They fail to properly explain anything. Imagine your story like a fine meal, and exposition is the seasoning. Sure, you could eat it as is without the seasoning, but it could be bland and tasteless. However, a little seasoning can make the meal that much more rich and flavorful. But it's also easy to overdo it. Don't let the seasoning replace the meal. Ever. But speaking of exposition, this script is getting kinda long, so I'll wrap things up with one more major point. Know who you're writing for. If you're just writing or creating to entertain yourself, then you don't have to listen to me or anyone for that matter. You're allowed to do what makes you happy without being judged, so long as it doesn't hurt or manipulate anyone. But to anyone who is writing for an audience, whether it be big or small, free or paid for, it's not just about you anymore. If you want your audience to respect your work, then you ultimately need to respect your audience and hold yourself to a higher standard than your own personal enjoyment or feelings. I write because I enjoy it and I enjoy seeing people's reactions. But if my work was creating just as much vitriol as it was love, then maybe I should address my perspective. But thankfully, YouTube has informed me that my work has about a 98% approval rating, so I think I'm doing okay. I think. But that, my friends, will be enough from me for now. I could go on, but like I said, we'd be here all year, and there are already tons of YouTube channels and videos out there explaining what I just talked about infinitely better than me. That being said, I hope those who requested this video enjoyed it, and if anyone else enjoyed this little lesson, then leave a like and comment. I hope each and every one of you have an amazing week, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Till then, stay safe, my friends.